I woke up at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning to 4 bank alerts back to back. By the time I picked up my phone, there was a fifth. Every single one said the same thing. Withdrawal confirmed. I sat there on the edge of the bed, squinting at the screen, thinking my account had been hacked. That was my first thought. Fraud. Someone got our card number. It happens. I'd deal with it, call the bank, get it sorted. That kind of thing had happened to my coworker Marcus the year before. And the bank reversed everything within 48 hours. So I wasn't panicking yet. Not really. Then I looked at the amounts. My name is Mike Brown. I'm 38 years old, and up until about 4 months ago, I lived what I'd honestly describe as a pretty quiet, pretty average life in Columbus, Ohio. I worked in logistics coordination for a mid-sized freight company. Nothing glamorous, but steady. I left the house by 7:15 most mornings, was back by 5:45 most evenings, and on weekends I'd either catch a game, do yard work, or drive my wife Claire somewhere she wanted to go. We'd been married for 6 years, together for 9. We had a house we were still paying off, 1 car each, a joint checking account, and a savings account we'd built together over 4 years. That savings account had $34,200 in it the last time I checked, which was about 3 weeks before that Tuesday morning. We didn't have kids. We had a dog named Hatch, a 7-year-old beagle mix who slept at the foot of the bed and barked at the mailman every single day like it was the first time he'd ever seen him. That was my life. That was our life. Nothing about it was exciting, and I mean that as a compliment. We weren't rich, we weren't struggling, we had what we'd worked for, and we were building something slow and steady the way most people around us were. Or at least that's what I believed. Before I go any further, if you're watching this from somewhere in the US, go ahead and drop your state in the comments. I'm always curious where people are tuning in from, and if something about this story already feels familiar to you, I'd like to hear that too. These things happen more often than most people admit. Subscribe if you want to hear the rest of it. I'm going to tell the whole thing. Claire and I had a routine that worked. She was a dental office manager on the north side of Columbus, had been there about 4 years. She made decent money, kept her own personal checking account for day-to-day stuff, but we both contributed to the joint account for bills, groceries, the mortgage, and savings. Every first of the month, we each transferred in our agreed amount. It had worked without conflict for as long as we'd been doing it. She was organized. More organized than me, honestly. She kept a spreadsheet for the household budget. She remembered when the car insurance renewed. She knew our credit scores off the top of her head. I used to joke that if it weren't for her, I'd be living on overdraft fees and expired coupons. Looking back now, I think about that a lot differently. We weren't in a great stretch, but nothing alarming. There had been some quietness between us. Fewer conversations at dinner. She'd been going to bed earlier than usual, and when I came in, she was usually already facing the wall. I figured she was tired. Her office had recently brought on 2 new dentists, which had changed the scheduling and added more administrative pressure on her end. She'd mentioned it a few times. I didn't push. I'm not someone who pushes. That's just how I am. I give people space when they seem like they need it, and I expect them to tell me if something's wrong. I've operated that way my whole life. In most situations, it served me fine. That particular situation, it did not. There was one evening, maybe 10 days before everything happened, where I came home and she wasn't there. That wasn't unusual in itself. She sometimes ran errands after work or stopped to see her sister Dana on the other side of town. But I noticed she hadn't said anything that morning about going anywhere. I texted her around 6:30. She replied about 40 minutes later, at Dana's, home soon. She got back around 9. I'd already eaten. She said she wasn't hungry, poured herself a glass of water, and went to shower. I didn't think too much of it. Just one of those evenings. There was another moment, maybe 5 or 6 days later. I was in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, and I noticed her laptop was open on the counter. She was in the back of the house doing something, and I wasn't trying to look. I just happened to glance at the screen when I walked past. It looked like she was on some kind of apartment listing site. I saw the word available and what looked like a monthly rent figure, but I didn't stop to read it. I told myself she was probably just browsing. We'd talked in passing, maybe a year ago, about eventually moving somewhere with a bigger yard. I thought maybe she was looking at houses. I didn't say anything. I made my coffee, and by the time she came back into the kitchen, the laptop was closed. I think about that moment a lot now. So back to that Tuesday morning, 6:14, 5 bank alerts. I opened the banking app and looked at the joint checking account first. The balance was $14. $14. 3 days before, it had been just over $6,800. That's where it typically sat mid-month after bills had gone out. I scrolled through the transaction history. Between 11:52 p.m. and 1:08 a.m., there had been a series of ATM withdrawals and 2 transfers. All of them authorized, all of them processed cleanly. No flags, no holds. The system had let every single one go through without interruption because, from the bank's side, nothing unusual had happened. The account holder had simply taken the money. Then I checked the savings account. 0. The savings account that we had built over 4 years that had sat at $34,200 3 weeks ago showed a balance of 0 and a single transaction dated 6 days earlier, a full transfer to an external account. I hadn't been notified because we didn't have alerts set up on that account at the time. Only the checking account had alerts. I had set those up after Marcus's situation and just never got around to doing the savings too. 6 days. The money had been gone for 6 days, and I hadn't known. I set my phone down on the nightstand. Hatch lifted his head and looked at me. I looked at the other side of the bed, Claire's side, which was empty, though that wasn't immediately strange. She sometimes got up early for work. I called out her name. No answer. I got up, walked down the hall, and checked the kitchen, the living room, the second bathroom. Her car wasn't in the driveway. Her coffee mug wasn't in the sink the way it always was. I went back to the bedroom and called her cell phone. It rang once and went to voicemail. Not the kind of voicemail where someone declines your call. The kind where the line goes quiet for a half second and then drops you directly into the recording. That usually means the phone is off. I stood in the bedroom in my socks, in the house I'd lived in for 4 years, with a dog staring up at me from the foot of the bed, and I tried to figure out what I was looking at. I still wasn't sure yet, but something in the back of my mind had already started working through it quietly, the way you sometimes solve a problem in your sleep without meaning to. And what it kept coming back to was the apartment listing site on her laptop. And the evening she came home from Dana's at 9 o'clock without being hungry, and the way she'd been facing the wall every night for 3 weeks. I gave myself about 10 minutes to sit with it before I did anything else. That's not something I'm particularly proud of, the stillness, but that's genuinely how I operate under pressure. I don't move fast when something's wrong. I slow down, I go quiet. My brain needs a minute to sort through the noise before it can figure out what's actually happening versus what it's assuming. So I sat on the edge of the bed, Hatch pressed up against my leg, and I went through the most reasonable explanations I could come up with. The first one I landed on was emergency. Maybe something had happened to someone in her family. Her mom, her dad, her sister Dana. And she'd left in a hurry in the middle of the night and hadn't wanted to wake me. Maybe she'd panicked and grabbed cash because she wasn't thinking clearly. Maybe her phone had died on the way and that's why it was going straight to voicemail. That explanation covered the empty house. It covered the car being gone. It even covered the phone being off. What it didn't cover was the savings account being emptied 6 days ago. I kept coming back to that. 6 days. That wasn't a panic decision made at midnight. That was something she had done calmly during business hours, almost a week before she disappeared. You don't accidentally initiate a full transfer of $34,200 to an external account. You set that up, you provide routing information, you confirm it. It takes a few steps and at least 1 business day to process. She had done that deliberately, and she had done it without saying a word to me. By the time I'd worked through all of that, the 10 minutes were up. I called her again. Same result. 1 ring, then voicemail. I didn't leave a message the second time. I texted instead, "Hey, I woke up to some bank alerts. Can you call me when you get this?" I kept it plain on purpose. I didn't accuse anything, I didn't ask where she was. I wanted to leave room for a normal explanation, even though the part of my brain that was already assembling the picture didn't believe there was one. Then I called Dana. Dana and Claire were close, 3 years apart, talked regularly, saw each other every few weeks. If Claire had gone anywhere in a hurry, Dana would either know or be the one she'd gone to. Dana picked up on the third ring, groggy. It was still early. "Hey Mike, what's going on?" "Sorry to call this early," I said. "Is Claire with you by any chance?" A pause. "No." "Why? What happened?" "She wasn't home when I got up, trying to track her down." Another pause, slightly longer this time. "I haven't talked to her since last week. Is everything okay?" I told her yes, probably just a miscommunication. I'd figure it out. I apologized again for waking her and got off the phone. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. Claire had told me 10 days ago that she was at Dana's. Dana had just told me she hadn't spoken to her since last week. That was the first thing I could point to directly. The first clear piece that didn't fit. I called out of work that morning. Told my supervisor I had a family situation, which was technically true, and that I'd be reachable by phone if anything urgent came up. He said fine and didn't ask questions. Then I made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and started going through what I actually knew. The savings account had been emptied 6 days ago. The checking account had been drained between midnight and just after 1 a.m. Her car was gone, her phone was off, and she wasn't at her sister's despite telling me she was there 10 days prior. That last detail, the lie about Dana, was bothering me more than I expected it to. It wasn't a dramatic lie. She hadn't come home crying or nervous that night. She'd come in, said she wasn't hungry, showered, and gone to bed. She'd been completely composed. That kind of composure, looking back, tells you something. I went to the spare bedroom, which doubled as a small home office, and opened the filing cabinet where we kept the important paperwork. Insurance, mortgage documents, vehicle titles, that kind of thing. I wasn't sure what I was looking for exactly. I just wanted to look at something concrete. Claire's personal account information was in there. We'd exchanged that years ago so we could list each other in case of emergency. I found her most recent personal bank statement from 2 months ago. She got paper statements because she didn't fully trust the app, which was something I'd always found a little amusing given how tech-forward she was in every other area of her life. I looked through the statement. Nothing struck me as obviously wrong. Normal purchases. Her direct deposit coming in every 2 weeks. A few transfers to the joint account. One recurring charge I didn't recognize, a subscription of some kind. But $14.99 a month wasn't something I was going to fixate on. What I did notice, though, was that her direct deposits were slightly lower than I'd expected based on what she'd told me she was making. Not dramatically lower, just enough that I found myself doing the math a second time. I put the statement down and made a mental note. Around noon, I drove to her office. I wasn't sure what I was going to say when I got there. I hadn't planned it. I think part of me just needed to see whether her car was in the parking lot, whether everything looked the way it always did, whether I was going to walk in there and find out this was all some absurd miscommunication that would embarrass me later. Her car wasn't there. I went in anyway. The front desk receptionist, a young woman named Priya, who I'd met once or twice at office events, looked up and recognized me. "Mr. Brown, hi. Are you here for an appointment?" "No," I said. "I'm actually looking for Claire. Is she in today?" Priya's expression shifted in a way that was subtle but clear. She glanced down at her screen, then back up at me. "She actually called in this morning, said she had a personal matter to take care of." "Did she say anything else?" "No, just that she'd be out today." A pause. "Is everything all right?" I smiled in a way that I hoped looked reassuring. "Yeah, just missed each other this morning. I'll reach her on her cell. Thanks, Priya." I walked back to my car and sat there for a moment. She had called her office. She had told them she wouldn't be in. She was functioning, making decisions, communicating, just not with me. That ruled out the emergency theory almost entirely. If something had happened to a family member and she was in crisis, she wouldn't be managing her professional obligations. She'd be focused on whatever the crisis was. The fact that she took time to call her workplace and arrange her absence told me she was thinking clearly and operating on some kind of plan. It also meant her phone wasn't dead or lost. She'd made a call. She was choosing not to answer mine. I drove home. I sat at the kitchen table again with my coffee gone cold in front of me, and I thought about the apartment listing I'd seen on her laptop. I tried to remember exactly what I'd seen. The word available. A monthly figure. I thought it had been somewhere around $1,100 or $1,200, but I wasn't certain. It was a glance, not a read. I hadn't seen an address. I hadn't seen anything I could use. But I pulled up my own laptop and I started browsing apartment listings in Columbus, just to get a feel for it. One-bedrooms in the north end of the city, near her office, were running between $900 and $1,400 a month, depending on the building and the neighborhood. Whatever she'd been looking at had fit right in that range. I spent about an hour on that before I realized I wasn't going to find anything useful. There were hundreds of listings. I didn't have an address. I didn't have a name she might have used. What I did have was her email address. We used a shared email for household accounts, utilities, subscriptions, that kind of thing, and I had the login. I pulled it up, and I started searching through it slowly. There was nothing obvious. No apartment confirmation emails, no move-in instructions. Whatever communication she'd had about a new place to live, she'd kept it off the shared account. That, too, told me something. It meant she'd been careful. By early evening, I still hadn't heard from her. Not a text, not a call, nothing. I'd sent one more message around 3 p.m. Still plain, still calm, and it had gone unanswered. I fed Hatch. I made something to eat that I barely tasted. I sat on the couch and watched the news without absorbing any of it. And then, mostly out of habit, I opened the banking app one more time. The joint checking account still showed $14. But when I scrolled down further into the transaction detail than I had that morning, I noticed something I'd missed in the initial shock. Below the ATM withdrawals and the transfers, there was a single point-of-sale charge from the night before at 11:31 p.m., 21 minutes before the first withdrawal. A gas station, one I didn't recognize, on a part of town I didn't know well. It was a $54 fill-up. She'd filled her tank the night before she left, nearly full, enough to go somewhere without stopping. I put my phone down and looked across the living room at nothing in particular. She hadn't panicked and run. She'd packed, planned, and fueled up, and now she was somewhere I didn't know, in a life she'd apparently been building without me, for longer than I was ready to admit. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was falling apart. I wasn't, not yet, but because my mind kept running the same loop. The gas station charge, the savings transfer 6 days prior, the lie about Dana, the apartment listing. Each detail on its own was explainable. Together, they formed something I couldn't talk myself out of anymore. By Wednesday morning, I had accepted one thing. She wasn't coming back on her own. I called the non-emergency police line and asked about filing a missing persons report. The officer I spoke with was polite but direct. He asked if there was any evidence of foul play, any reason to believe she was in danger. I told him about the bank withdrawals. He went quiet for a moment, then told me, carefully, that if a person voluntarily leaves, especially with access to shared finances, there's generally no criminal matter for them to investigate. He suggested I contact a family law attorney. That was the moment it shifted for me. Fully and without question. This wasn't a crisis. This was a decision. I called her one more time that afternoon, still off. I texted Dana again and asked directly this time when she'd last actually spoken to Claire. Dana took about 2 hours to respond, and when she did, the message was short. She called me about 2 weeks ago. She said she needed some time. I'm sorry, Mike, I didn't know what to say. 2 weeks ago. Claire had told her sister she needed some time 2 weeks before she left. Dana had known something was coming and hadn't said a word to me. I didn't respond to Dana right away. I needed a minute with that. Then I drove to our bank and sat down with the branch manager. I explained the situation plainly, the overnight withdrawals, the savings transfer, the fact that my wife was unreachable. He pulled up the accounts with my ID and confirmed everything I already knew. All transactions were authorized. Her name was on the accounts. There was nothing the bank could flag as fraud. He did tell me one thing I hadn't known. The external account the savings had been transferred into had been opened 3 months ago. She'd opened a separate account somewhere else 3 months ago and had been routing money into it gradually before the final full transfer. 3 months. I sat with that number in the parking lot afterward. 3 months of parallel planning, 3 months of normal dinners, normal weekends, normal conversations, while she was quietly building a way out. That evening I went through the house more carefully than I had before. Her closet was about 2/3 empty, not stripped bare. She'd left things behind, winter coats, some shoes, a few boxes on the upper shelf. But the everyday clothes were gone. The toiletries in the bathroom had been thinned out. Her passport wasn't in the fireproof box where we kept documents, though mine was still there. Her grandmother's ring, which she kept in a small dish on the dresser, was gone. These weren't things you grab in a panic at midnight. These were things you pack over time, slowly, so no single day looks different from the last. I thought about the past few weeks and tried to remember if I'd noticed her carrying anything to her car. A bag, a box, anything. I couldn't recall a single instance, which either meant I hadn't been paying attention or she'd been patient enough to move things in small amounts over many trips. Probably both. Late that night, I found something I wasn't looking for. I was going through the filing cabinet again, more thoroughly this time, and tucked behind our mortgage folder was a manila envelope I didn't recognize. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a printed credit card statement for an account I had never seen before. A card in her name only, with a balance of just over $11,000. The statement was 4 months old. The charges on it were a mix of things. Some retail, some cash advances, a few recurring charges to services I didn't recognize. One charge appeared 11 times over several months from what looked like a money transfer platform. The second document was a letter, not addressed to me. Addressed to her from a collections agency about a separate debt, a personal loan she had apparently taken out over 2 years ago. The letter was dated 7 months back and referenced a balance of just over $18,000. I sat on the floor of that spare bedroom for a long time, somewhere between $29,000 and $30,000 in debt she had never mentioned. Not once, not even close. And now she was gone, along with $34,200 from our savings and nearly $7,000 from checking. I wasn't just looking at abandonment anymore. I was looking at the reason for it. She hadn't left because something broke between us. She'd left because she'd run out of road. I didn't hear from Claire for 11 days. When she finally reached out, it wasn't a phone call. It was a text. Short, measured, and in a way that I think says everything, carefully worded enough that it couldn't be used against her in any legal proceeding. I know that now. I didn't fully understand it then. It said, "I'm sorry for how I handled this. I needed to leave. I'll be in touch through an attorney." That was it. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the money. No mention of the debt. I read it twice, put my phone face down on the table, and went and stood in the backyard for a while. Hatch followed me out and sat next to my foot. The weather was cold and I hadn't grabbed a jacket, but I stayed out there longer than I needed to. The attorney contact came about a week later. Divorce papers, essentially already drafted. She'd been working with someone for at least a month, based on the filing dates, which meant the legal process had been running parallel to the packing, the account draining, and the quiet dinners. I got my own attorney, a woman named Patricia, who came recommended by a guy I worked with. In our first meeting, I laid out everything: the joint account withdrawals, the savings transfer, the hidden credit card, the collections letter, the external account opened 3 months before she left. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "She moved fast, but she didn't move clean." That's the line I remember most from those early weeks. The legal process took the better part of 8 months. I won't walk through every detail because most of it was slow and procedural and deeply unglamorous. What I'll say is this: the financial picture that came out during discovery was worse than what I'd found in that filing cabinet. The personal loan was real, $18,400, 2 years old, largely unpaid. The credit card balance had grown to just under $13,000 by the time we were in proceedings. There was also a second credit card I hadn't found, smaller, but it existed. And the money transfer charges I hadn't recognized on that statement, those traced back to a person. A name I didn't know. My attorney didn't characterize what that meant. She didn't need to. I understood it. The court ultimately treated the joint account withdrawals as dissipation of marital assets. I won't pretend the outcome made me whole. It didn't, not financially. But some of what she'd taken was factored into the settlement division, which shifted things modestly in my favor. The house I kept. She didn't contest it. I think she wanted a clean exit more than she wanted to fight over equity. I won't tell you I handled all of it well. There were weeks that were harder than I've let on here. The kind of hard that's not dramatic. It's just quiet and heavy and present every morning when you wake up in a house that used to hold 2 people and now holds 1. What I will tell you is that I didn't fall apart permanently. I kept going to work. I kept feeding Hatch. I called my brother more than I had in years, which turned out to be one of the better things to come out of all of it. I also started paying closer attention to my own financial life in a way I hadn't before. Not obsessively, just honestly. I knew my accounts. I knew what was coming in and what was going out. I set up alerts on everything, small, practical adjustments that I should have made years earlier. The person she'd been transferring money to. I eventually found out who it was, not through the legal process directly, but through someone who knew someone. I'm not going to name him or describe him in detail, because that part of the story honestly matters less than I thought it would. What I'll say is that it didn't make me feel better to know. It didn't provide the kind of clarity people assume it does. It was just another piece of information, and by the time I had it, I was already far enough along that it mostly just confirmed what I'd already accepted. She had been living a second life, quietly, for longer than I knew. The leaving wasn't impulsive. The debt, the other account, the other person, those things had been building for a long time before that Tuesday morning. I was the last part of the picture she removed. I'm not telling this story because I think I'm unique. I'm telling it because I know I'm not. These things happen in ordinary houses, to ordinary people, in the middle of completely ordinary lives. And the hardest part isn't the dramatic moment, it's the slow realization that the version of your life you believed in wasn't entirely real. You rebuild. Not quickly and not all at once. But you do. Hatch still barks at the mailman every single day. Some things, at least, stay exactly the same. If something in this story resonated with you, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. Not because I need company in it, but because I think these conversations matter more than most people let them. If you've been watching this far and haven't subscribed yet, consider it. There are more stories like this one. Real, slow, and honest. That's all I'm trying to offer here.